I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who has this week experienced a little disaster fatigue. I found myself trying to think about joy and return to that place. And it was a big challenge. But today I want to talk about generosity and its relationship to joy, and sometimes in the midst of sorrow and suffering and things going on around us, that is the very time to return to what it means to be open-hearted in the world. Because our response often, when we get tired of so much suffering, is to just shut down. And yet I want you to think for a moment, even in the midst of such tragedy in the North Bay, the kind of outpouring of generosity that has already happened. For every tragic story, there are 5 or 6 heroic stories of incredible generosity. People saying, yes, we lost our home, but we have our lives, we have our families. People returning to those things that they value most deeply in the midst of pain. The pursuit of happiness is an American ideal as much as it is a spiritual ideal as well, isn't it? And we want people to be happy. That's why we're so sad when tragic things happen. We want people to be happy. After all, one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that, all men are created equal, we'll talk about that later, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, that's right, an unalienable right, the pursuit of happiness. This phrase is attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Actually, John Locke, a century earlier, wrote about life, liberty, and property. But Thomas Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and happiness. Happiness and the right to pursue it, at least for men, is an American ideal. The bedrock of our American ethos. And according to the Declaration of Independence, it is also a spiritual right, because these unalienable rights were endowed upon us by our Creator. Now, what our founders meant by happiness, and what we understand happiness today, or think of it currently in our society, may not be the same thing. We've got, happy hour, we have happy meals. We're just happy, happy, happy. But the founders had some understanding of social happiness, or what we might term the common good, even if that good did not extend or was beyond the reach in that time of women and slaves. But there is a difference between pleasure and happiness, and I think the founders were getting at that somewhat. We experience pleasure through our senses. It's a sensory experience, right? A good meal, good song, good sex. Pleasure through our senses. And these things can bring us joy too, but pleasure is temporary, while joy or happiness is long-lasting. We experience happiness, the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu say, at a deeper level through our mind, such as love and compassion and generosity. And this deeper level of happiness or joy has to do with fulfillment, and this comes from within. This is the message that the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu give over and over and over. Have you heard the recurring theme? It has to come from within. The theists, which Desmond Tutu is, say it comes from within and it comes from God. The non-theist, like the Dalai Lama, says it comes from the training of the mind. Happen to believe that both are true. We are so easily externally focused in our pursuit of joy and happiness. And I think partly that's because we have to admit, we're a very materialistic society. We're dependent on sensory experience. But the happiness and joy that we're exploring this fall ultimately again, comes from within. Pleasure, hedonism, the Greek called it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. I think the current manifestation of hedonism in our culture is consumerism. We want to buy one more thing. And sometimes buying something does make us feel good for a moment. But it's not that lasting, that sustaining kind of joy that these spiritual greats are talking about. The more we experience pleasure, the more we become numb to its effects. So the first bowl of ice cream, I guess ice cream's a theme today. The first bowl of ice cream is sublime. The second bowl is tasty. The third bowl, indigestion. But when we pay attention to the mind level, the heart level of joy and happiness, we do that by meditating on embracing compassion and generosity in our lives. We all want to be happy. And I think sometimes we are surprised by how happy we are when we make someone else happy. I mean, think about it. Think of young children when they want to give you a present. They've bought you something and they're waiting for you to open it. They can hardly stand it because they want to make you happy. They want you to love what they have given you. This giving of self, this generosity, is a scientific as well as a spiritual truth. In every spiritual tradition, you will find at the heart of it this concept of generosity. In Islam, giving of alms is called zakat, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In Judaism, tzedakah, which also means justice. In Buddhism, it's dana. You give dana to your teacher. It's giving of self, but it's giving of your resources to support your teacher. And in Christianity, it's called charity. We don't use that word as much anymore, but charity also means love. This generosity that's invited not only expresses our interdependence, but it really has a lot of wisdom in it because it is the path to well-being. And the ancient spiritual teachers knew this. So it's spiritual and it's scientific. Richard Davidson, who's in neuroscience here in San Francisco, studies the brain, and he's discovered 4 independent brain circuits that affect our well-being. 4 independent brain circuits. The first one is our ability to maintain positive states, positive state of mind. You start with love and compassion. The second brain circuit is our ability to recover from negative states, which is about resilience. And those two are not the same circuit. Is that interesting? The third is our ability to focus and avoid mind wandering. So please turn on your third brain circuits right in this moment. Our ability to focus and not have mind wandering. The fourth brain circuit is our ability to be generous. There's an entire brain circuit devoted to generosity. Don't you love that? I love that. That's why our brain feels so good when we give to others. Not only a spiritual truth, but a scientific one as well. Why? Because we are hardwired for cooperation. We are not hardwired for competition. We know that the most recent studies on evolution say that it happened by cooperation, not competition. And that is why, as I was studying this week and reading, I was thinking about, that's why this drive, this evolutionary and spiritual drive for cooperation and complementarianism, that's why the polarization in our country right now is so alienating and so disorienting. It leads us to be other than ourselves. Because the strongest predictor of our happiness, of our joy, is the quality of our relationships and the generosity that we bring to these relationships. And we wonder why we're at the place we are in our country right now. And how that's trickling down to affect every one of us. Generosity is a pillar of joy. The Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu are very clear that money can buy you happiness if you give it away. If you give it away. If you spend it on other people. An immutable spiritual truth, by giving, we receive. This generosity of spirit is how we give our time, which is crucial to our well-being and health, how we give of our resources, and how we give of ourselves. The text that John read for us this morning from Luke's Gospel is actually from Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. Don't judge. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. The measure you give out is the measure you will receive. I used to read that as pejorative, like an admonition. The measure you give is the measure you receive. Now I realize it's simply descriptive. The more you give, the more you will receive. We are most miserable when we are closed in and focused on ourselves. It's just a truth. And you talk about a recurring theme in the book of joy. Every pillar of joy has to do with less of self, less self-focus. Maya Angelou, the great poet, says, "I've learned that you shouldn't go through life with a catcher's mitt on both hands. You need to throw something back." Desmond Tutu gives the example of the Dead Sea, and he says, "The Dead Sea receives fresh water, but it has no outlet, so it doesn't pass the water out. It receives beautiful water, but it goes dank. Why? The Dead Sea receives, but it does not give." This generosity that they're talking about, this generosity of spirit, generosity of sharing resources, this generosity of spirit is less tied to any self-agenda. Generosity of spirit doesn't keep score. There's nothing to prove. And in God's math, there is no subtraction. Again, when you think of the fires this week, the extraordinary acts of heroism and generosity, and think of your own response. You wanted to do something, didn't you? You wanted to help. You wanted to protect. That impulse is generosity. Even Safeway. I checked out at Safeway, and before I went to plug in my card, up popped, "Donate. Would you like to make a," have you seen it? Like to make a donation to the victims of the wildfires in California. So I hit the donate button, and the cashier said, "Thank you for your generosity." I wanted to say, I'm preaching about that tomorrow, but generosity of spirit. If we want to know more joy in our lives, even in the midst of hard times, it's about open-heartedness. It's about sharing. It's about giving. It really is. And fortunately, generosity is something that this community knows a lot about. Amen.